And bear with me for a few minutes. I'll try to walk you through recent 10, 15 years, because to understand what's going on in Ukraine, you need to understand why Russian government can do what it does, and why the political equilibrium is so much connected to economic history of the last 10 or 15 years. And basically, the economy is now not growing. It is actually stagnating. And this is a big difference from the first 10 years of Putin's government, starting in 1999 and ending with the crisis of 2008, 2009. At that 10-year period, Russian economy was growing at 7% per year average. This is a most outstanding decade in Russian economic history, even including industrialization in the 1930s, when the economy was not growing as fast. And what has contributed to it? Well, first, it's luck. A lot of people would talk about Mr. Putin's main strength being lucky and fortunate. He came exactly at the right moment when oil prices were low and started to grow and kept growing for 10 years. He came at the moment when unemployment was 14%. It's now 5.5%. He came at the moment where it was a lot of spare capacity, slack in the economy, which was with the growing oil price getting back to normal. And that, of course, helped to fuel the growth. But it's not, of course, the only story. Russian economy at that point was reformed, privatized, more competitive than it was before and than it is now. And with the money flowing in, it actually picked up and recovered really quickly. And then I should give credit to Mr. Putin, who introduced a number of reforms in microeconomics, deregulating the economy, improving property rights at that point, and also introducing macroeconomic stability. Russia balanced the budget. Russia repaid foreign debt. Now foreign debt of Russia is 10% of GDP. This is the lowest among largest countries, among emerging countries as well. And that fueled growth. That brought investment, foreign investment including, and the growth continued. And Russian public, of course, was very happy to see that. And that explains Mr. Putin's popularity, which continues today. You can actually break the data month by month, and you can see that economic performance is highly correlated with support, approval rankings of Mr. Putin. Now, that all changed in 2008, when Russian economy collapsed by 8% in 2009. And then it only recovered first at the 4% a year, and now, and then at 3% a year. And last year, 2013, the official data are 1.3% a year. So the slowdown actually started pretty much after the economic crisis. First recovery was going on backed by consumption. Consumer lending, for example, non-mortgage consumer lending grew by 40% in 2012 and by 30% in 2013. So consumption was actually growing. This source of growth is probably exhausted by now. The other things which I mentioned, oil prices, which are high but probably not going to grow for a while, the spare capacity, the cheap labor, all that is gone. So it is not surprising that the economy is stagnating. What is surprising is, given that it's not rocket science, to what extent Mr. Putin and his government are not doing much about this. In this country, you sometimes say it is the government which is the problem. And it is exactly what investors in Russia and outside of Russia think about Russian investment climate. When John was moderating a panel in Davos a year ago, he asked the audience, out of 5 possible explanations of Russian economic problems, what is the most likely? Out of 5 questions, 80% of people in the audience in Davos plenary session, 80% said governance, which is corruption, which is expansion of inefficient government companies, which is a non-accountability of the government. And with the popularity that Mr. Putin enjoyed over these years, he managed to renationalize the commanding heights of Russian economy, and somehow he didn't bring corruption in check. Corruption has grown, and still he continued to be quite popular. Investors didn't like that. Investment today in Russia is still below what it used to be in 2008. And it's also actually falling. And the stock prices are low. So there are some facts and figures in your books where you can see that PE, price-earnings ratios for American companies are 20. As you probably know, emerging markets on average have 12. In Russia, before the war, it was 6, and Gazprom was trading at 2.5 annual profits, right? So investors don't like investment climate in Russia. And they are taking money out. The capital outflow, of course, was very high during the crisis. Then the situation reversed. And then the capital flow returned to Russia in 2010. And it was not clear why, because Europe was in trouble, US was in trouble in 2010, and yet investors were taking money out of Russia to Europe. First, the explanation was that it is Moscow mayor who is fired and his wife is taking money out of Russia. His wife is the richest woman, coincidentally, in Russia, was at that point involved in construction sector. And so the idea was that the first 10 or 15 or $20 billion of net outflow can be explained by immigration of a Moscow mayor. But then afterwards, people started to say, maybe that's too much. Maybe we need to think about other explanations. And then people started to think, well, in 2011, there will be an election. In 2012, there will be an election. Maybe there is a political instability that investors are afraid of. Election happened. We now have scientific evidence that it wasn't honest. If you have questions, I'm happy to talk about that. But after the election, it turned out that investors are unhappy about political stability much more than they were unhappy about political instability. And in that sense, we are arriving today at the situation where everybody understands that investment is low, and this is exactly why Russian economy is stagnating. And investment is low because government is a problem, because government is an unaccountable, large, omnipotent, and not benevolent. And in that sense, it is not surprising that the economy is stagnating. Now, the question is, what's going to happen with that, and why this is connected to what's going on in Ukraine? And the simple explanation is that Mr. Putin was popular, and his social compact with the population was, you're living better and better every day, leave me alone. I will do what I want. And that was the social compact, and the Russian population was very happy with that. But this is now gone, because income stopped to grow. 7% growth is one universe, 1% growth is another universe. And that 1% may become zero, actually, in the first quarter of this year. And so Mr. Putin needs to come up with another offer to Russian public. And this offer should include some non-material values. And his offer is, how about we have an ideology? How about we have an external enemy? How about we don't care about the money that much, but we care about something else? Great Russia. How about we stand up to the West, which is imperialistic? So we are the only power that can stop Americans or Europeans from interfering here and there in different countries in the Middle East, for example, or somewhere else. And this is exactly what Mr. Putin is selling to Russian public. Now, it is not as easy in the sense that it's not only brainwashing, but also bribing and repression. Condi said, I'm a brave person. It's easy to be brave when you live in Paris. But there are some people who are in jail for going to the street and expressing their opinion. One person I know probably best is Alexei Navalny, who's under house arrest. And this is the guy who apparently has done nothing wrong, because if he would have done something wrong, that would be proven. And now all the accusations against him are completely laughable. And then on top of that, there is outright censorship. And this is exactly what's happening these days in Moscow, when independent internet media actually closed, including Mr. Navalny's blog, including some other independent websites. And in that sense, the equilibrium is changing. Because even Russian public cannot understand why we need to invade Ukraine if it looks like just 20 years ago we signed this treaty that Ukraine is an independent country and has a right to preserve its territorial sovereignty. And in that sense, the reason for many unpredictable things happening is probably going back to Russian economy. Is related to the fact that economy is stagnating. Now the question is, and this is where political scientists in the room would be completely with me, but businessmen usually don't understand why Mr. Putin is not interested in more growth. Okay? So can't you actually not introduce political competition, but instead provide better investment climate, fight corruption, attract foreign investors? The bigger the pie, the greater is your piece, right? So if GDP grows faster, maybe the elite would have a bigger piece itself. This is true to the extent that the measures needed to improve investment climate do not reduce the probability for you to stay and enjoy the piece. And unfortunately, the trade-off is we can have growth, but low probability of the current elite to stay where it is. Or we can have stagnation, and that would be a smaller pie, but a bigger piece and with a higher probability. And in that sense, I'm not surprised that the economy is stagnating. I am surprised, however, that Mr. Putin is reacting in this way. A month ago, I was given a similar talk on the East Coast, and people asked me how he would react to Ukraine, and I said, we don't know how he will react, but he will react beyond expectations. And in that sense, my forecast is right. But I didn't expect anything like this at all, and people around Mr. Putin, only a few people around Mr. Putin actually participated in this decision-making. And in that sense, he surprised us all. And I think one problem of current regime is fighting the media freedom actually has a cost. You lose independent feedback channels. You don't actually know how the world works, what people around, people in this country and in different countries think. And I think in that sense, I think it was a mistake, not only for everybody here, but also for people in the elite. And in that sense, I think we are living in very, very dangerous times. And I'll stop here. That it's not only the middle class that benefit from the growth. The growth did trickle down to everybody. And Mr. Putin enjoys this support because Russians live as well as ever in terms of consumption, in terms of lifestyle, and also in terms of their freedom within their house. I think we all know that Russia is becoming more nationalistic and homophobic, but actually within the closet, you can still enjoy the personal freedom. And some very close lieutenants of Mr. Putin are gays, and he's okay with that as long as they don't go public about that. And in that sense, Russians say, compared to Soviet Union, life is so much better. Right. We do have our small freedom space. We do have the consumption. But you're right, it cannot go on forever because expectations are much higher. And something will have to give. And in Moscow, it did change. In Moscow, people took to the street in December 2011 and in 2012. And for a while, Mr. Putin tolerated that, but that has changed. After the Olympics, people who took to the street in May 2012 went for several years in prison, and Mr. Navalny went under house arrest. And last week, or this week, we actually had closures of independent media outlets, and in that sense, his multi-faceted approach to handling this challenge is people who are not afraid and who are informed. For them, I have repression. People whom I can convince that all economic problems are due to Americans conspiring against Russia. For them, I'll try to use propaganda. And people who are thinking about that situation is not going to be sustainable, and we need to think about some other solutions, I'll try to bribe them. And one other thing is a lot of people of upper middle class just live too well. Not just IKEA, but more like Bentleys and Rolls Royces. And Moscow is in some recent years, Moscow would be the champion in terms of number of billionaires, more than New York or Shanghai. And it is actually a very expensive city. So he's worried about this question as much as you are.
Mm-hmm. How effective do you think blocking the foreign accounts of the major plutocrats is going to be in terms of turning them against Putin?
It's a very important question. I think it's going to be quite effective. So when US introduced so-called Magnitsky Act in November, December 2012, that was a major blow to the regime. And it's not surprising that the regime reacted very rationally and very quickly with something completely counterproductive. So government introduced an act which prohibited Americans adopting Russian kids, Russian orphans. And in Russia, foreigners can only adopt kids that Russians don't want to adopt. And in most cases, Americans would adopt sick kids who could be nurtured to health only in a rich country. And so we actually have Russian kids dying because of that reaction. And that reaction was angry and knee-jerk exactly because Mr. Putin was very unhappy. If you actually look at Russian foreign policy doctrine, which is one of the decrees Mr. Putin signed on May 7, 2012, the day when he once again became a president, one of the items in the foreign policy doctrines says, we don't want things like that to happen. We don't want unilateral violations of economic and travel freedoms of Russian citizens. This is one of the major foreign policy goals of Russian foreign service. And in that sense, it will be a major blow. Now, in the last couple of years, Mr. Putin actually has forced and encouraged many of his friends to remove assets from abroad to Russia, to repatriate assets. But we know that many of them have not done that, and we know they will be quite unhappy about that. But will they actually oppose Mr. Putin? That I don't think. But they will be very unhappy.
News reports today say that Russia is preparing for the worst case in trade sanctions, that we're already starting to see European and U.S. banks cutting bank lines to Russian companies, and they're setting up state guarantees for bank lines. My contacts in Russia appear to be cultivating Asian sources, looking to what's going on there, do you think?
I think this is what Russia is thinking about. So if you actually try to produce the pecking order of sanctions, the less painful ones are removing Russia from G8 or OECD, not coming to G8 summit, turning it into G1 summit. This is something that Mr. Putin is unhappy about, but he doesn't care. Then the visa bans and asset freezes of important members of the government. This is much more painful. Then what we just said, banks, disconnecting Russia from international banking system. This is very painful. But indeed, there are Asian banks, and I'm sure Russia will move to the Asian banks and will try to do business with Asian banks. And then the nuclear option is, well, unfortunately, it's no longer a joke, right? But we are talking about nuclear countries, talking about military actions. But the nuclear option is an oil embargo, gas embargo, something like was imposed on Iran. Now, this is very hard for Europeans to do because Germany depends on Russian gas. And this is, I think, Russia considers, but is not too scared about. But if that happens, I think unless China or some other countries join this embargo, which is probably unlikely, Russia will still be able to sell through other channels. And that would be costly. Infrastructure is not there, but it is possible. So I think it's not Iran-like sanctions. It is impossible exactly because Asia will not join those. In many European countries, the top companies have tens of % of their business dependent on cooperation with Russian counterparts. So in that sense, that will be very unpopular in Europe.
In the discussions with Putin today, how that affects both the economy and the geopolitical calculus. Heavy dependence on oil and gas, both for the economy, but as a lever in trying to assert their role and their power particularly in Eastern Europe today, but really around the world. There's been a suggestion here that with the enormous access that we now have, the United States now has to unconventional oil and gas, that one of the things that we could do longer term is to free up our ability to export natural gas, particularly into Europe, Eastern Europe, where the Ukraine is essentially 100% dependent on Russia for natural gas today. It's going to take some time for us to do that because we've really got to convert import facilities to export facilities, so it isn't going to happen over time. But my question is, will that be a significant deterrent to Putin, either for pure economic reasons or for geopolitical leverage reasons, if we were to make it clear that we are going to move aggressively in that direction?
If oil prices and gas prices go down, Russia will really run out of money. I was talking about stagnation, so economic slowdown, stagnation. This is happening when oil price is at 100. If oil price goes down by $20 per barrel or by $40 per barrel, Russia has some reserves to buffer the shock, but it cannot sustain that without really cutting incomes of people who like Mr. Putin. And they will stop liking him once their pensions, once their salaries will go down. And in that sense, exporting natural gas to Europe, where it's so expensive, investing in shale gas in Ukraine, for example, these things will change the equation really by a great margin. And one of the things which Mr. Putin is worried about that a lot. So one of the things which happened once we were on a panel with him, and the moderator remembered, it was 2010, and so he was looking back on his years in power and pontificating, and he's delivered a lot to the Russian population. But one of the things he said, we've not diversified the economy, and that's actually a problem. He understands all of those issues. And then I was asking in private people, does he have plan B if oil prices go down and gas prices go down? And the answer was economic advisors have talked to me about this for so many times, and they've been wrong. Whenever I needed oil price to go up, it always went up. And he's right. We academics, we should recognize that all the data points, all the observations are consistent with his theory that somehow he will get through that. It will probably take one more observation which contradicts that theory to change everything. But so far, I think he believes that somehow he will get through it. And, but yet the numbers tell us that maybe when he runs out of money, something will have to change. So the basic answer is oil and gas doesn't depend on the quality of the governance, of the political institutions, of the judiciary system, of the financial system, as much as all these things you were talking about. Human capital intensive industries. They need the very sophisticated financial system. They need protection of property rights from government, from corrupt government officials, and from politically connected large companies. And this is something which doesn't exist in Russia, and that's why it's not surprising that oil sector and gas sector is doing so much better than software engineers who choose to build their companies somewhere here. So one of the champions of diversification is Yandex, the very successful Russian search company, which when it listed in NASDAQ in 2011 said, we have a risk that government will become, will start tightening the political, start removing political freedoms, and that will hurt our business because they produce news, they use online payments, which are very important for crowdfunding civil activists and political movements, and they warned investors that that may hurt our business. And they were right. Yesterday, Nasdaq stock price for Yandex went down 10%. In that sense, it's not surprising. Once, in 2001, I actually asked Mr. Putin, how do you see Russia in 2010? Okay? And that was a World Economic Forum meeting, so many important people were there, and he said, we will be happy. Okay? And at that point, it was not clear what he meant by happy. I didn't understand what exactly he meant. He didn't have time to elaborate on that. But now I think the main question was about we, whom he meant when he said we will be happy. And we see that the system that is built in Russia is good for some industries and not others. It's not surprising that in some industries you can actually prosper, and these industries include oil and gas and metals and so on. And yet another question is more recent. You mentioned Mr. Medvedev. One of his important projects was Skolkovo Institute of Technology. This is a partnership with Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And just today, I was exchanging emails with my former colleague, who is a vice president of Skolkovo, who was Condi student here, Alexei Sitnikov. He says hi, but he says that the current crisis doesn't help developing an institution like this. I can go on and on like that, but it's certainly the anti-Western hysteria, isolation, doesn't help innovation, diversification, international investment. And I would just want to quote a report which was published last week, actually this week, about the New Economic School. I was running New Economic School for 9 years. I'm very happy and proud of what my colleagues and myself did. And this report said, New Economic School, that was promoted by Russian media. The report said, we experts, unknown experts, we estimate the contribution of New Economic School to Russian economy and politics as a hostile, medium-intensity military intervention. Because New Economic School trains mainstream economists, and this is really bad for Russian development. So with these things, when you think that you need to invest in knowledge, education, and so on and so forth, this political stance is not really helpful. But even without recent crisis, which generated all this propaganda and brainwashing, even without recent crisis, you have fundamental interest of the ruling elite not to develop things which reduce bribe-taking and expropriation.
Yes. Other questions? Yes, right here. Let's see, we need a microphone down here, please. Yeah, we want to make sure that you can be heard. Just 1 second, she's right there.
You've talked about the possible embargo of oil and gas, and that's the only sort of product you've talked about. But clearly, if that trade stopped, they still have the assets in the ground, and when the sun comes out again, with the passage of time, they get back into the game. But are there other diversified products, goods and services that Russia could be selling in an integrated international economy that they're missing out on in this period of time if we wind up being at odds?
You're asking a question about the general structure or potential structure of Russian economy, or about sanctions?
Are there other products that they can sell into the international economy that would encourage international trade that would stop in the event of this? Or is it just the oil and gas?
No, so currently, if you add up oil, gas, and metals, and fertilizers and other natural resources and commodities, you would end up with 90% of Russian exports. The oil and gas taxes account for half of Russian budget, 10% of GDP. So Russia is not Saudi Arabia. Russia is actually quite diversified as a domestic economy. But in terms of its participation in the global economy, it is actually very, very much natural resource dependent. And what will happen, though, with capital outflow going up, ruble weakening, maybe some other industries will become more competitive. But at the moment, Russia's comparative advantage is oil and gas.
For those of us that have investments in substantial funds in Russia managed by Americans investing primarily in the Russian public market. What dangers, if any, do you see of blockage or confiscation of those funds if the West takes strong retaliatory powers against them?
I think with what's going on right now, it is not. Yeah, it is not impossible to rule out scenarios which we 2 weeks ago think being impossible. And I think expropriation of American companies' assets is completely on the table. And I think well, you have pretty much all major American companies having some assets on the ground. Alcoa has 2 plants. Exxon has invested a lot. Caterpillar invested a lot. Boeing doesn't have production capacity, but has R&D units. You have quite a few R&D units of Silicon Valley firms as well. This, of course, makes no sense to expropriate still. But some production facilities are there, and I wouldn't rule out the scenario where these assets will be expropriated. Moreover, very high-ranking Russian officials last week actually said, we will respond to sanctions in this particular way.
Yes, right over here.
One policy that has been absent from the discussion is the effect of the tapering of the monetary stimulus in the U.S. on both the economy
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
So one policy that hasn't been discussed is the effect of the tapering of the monetary stimulus in the U.S. And I was wondering if you could comment both on the economic and political repercussions.
Russian stock market benefited from loose monetary policy, like any other emerging market. But there is what economists would call difference in different. So on top of normal kind of emerging markets effects of monetary policy changes in the US, there is a Russian component, which is investors are more worried not only about monetary policy in the US, but also things like isolation and expropriation. And in that sense, it's not surprising that if you look at performance of stock markets from, say, January 1st to date, you will see that Russian market lost a quarter since January 1st, and other emerging markets lost, whatever, 8%. Everybody's worried, but quantitatively, there are many other things which investors should be worried about.
I see all over the world that the communication and information revolution has changed the problem of governance. So people can know what's going on. They protest, they organize. It's not just in the Middle East. And at least as far as I can see in the Ukraine, what happened was the people were moving west, and Mr. Putin didn't like it, and he intervened in some ways in a corrupt way as far as the leader was concerned. People know it right away, and they protested. And that set off this set of events. So my question is, and you can see that when some girls sing songs of protest, he feels he has to arrest them. So you ask yourself, how restive are the people in Russia? And to what degree is there some likelihood that you may see protests emerge there, as they were early in Mr. Putin's re-election campaign?
Thanks. There are many aspects to your question. I will start with the quantitative economic research in Moldova, which some economists have done. Moldova is an interesting country where a lot of people migrate and send remittances back and also come back home. And Moldova is divided in the sense that there are some people migrate west and some people migrate east. And people who migrate west actually learn about value of democracy and possibility to live without corruption, come back and vote for liberal parties. And this research actually shows that these people who migrated west, rather than those who migrated east, were critical to bringing down communist party, which still was in power in 2009, 2010. And the same goes on in Russia. But in Russia, unlike, say, Middle East, North Africa, Condi mentioned voice, and he also mentioned voice. But then a famous development economist, Albert Hirschman, said that in addition to voice, there is also exit. So some people protest by exiting. And this is where Mr. Putin is very smart compared to Soviet leaders who didn't allow people to exit. He basically says, you want to exit, we are a free country, you can exit. Now, there is now a talk that may change, but he's been very stubborn, saying, I'm happy if people just leave. It's okay if you just leave. You shouldn't be in the country protesting. And given how rich and educated these people you are talking about are, they can easily move to now Ukraine or Western Europe or the US. You see a lot of them here. And Mr. Putin is very happy about that because he loses the potential protesters. Condi made a number of times, Condi said that we want Russian students here to see the value of democracy. This is perceived in Russia as a threat to the regime, literally. Russian government finally, after many years, and I'm also proud that this is finally happening, Russian government will send Russian students abroad and pay for it, and if they come back, pay for it. And I expect that this program will not materialize with regard to the US. Exactly for the reason Condi mentioned, exactly for the reason you were talking about, because they would learn too much about how democratic government can work. Now, in the long run, I'm of course optimistic about Russia. Russia has all the fundamentals for economic growth and prosperity. There is nothing innate or genetic in Russia about being authoritarian. Every country in the world was not a democracy when the history started. And this transition has happened in many countries, and it will happen in Russia. Now, how it will happen? Through protests, through natural causes, through financial problems. That I cannot say. One thing which political scientists, political economists know is regimes like this change in a very unpredictable way. And I've been through change in Soviet Union when a regime which was forever suddenly became never more. And that happened overnight. And nobody really saw how it would evolve. So it could be a very turbulent or violent transition, could be very peaceful regime change, but it will happen. Russia's too rich and too educated to be a non-democracy. Now, it is actually going to be a historical moment because if Russia transits to democracy before Saudi Arabia, it will be the richest country in history moving from dictatorship to democracy. So it doesn't have to be violent. And it may happen actually through peaceful protests. So we don't know.
Yes, right in back.
Hi. In 2008, I was a student here, and I moved to Russia to study what was happening in Georgia. And I see the crisis in Ukraine having a lot of similar patterns to what was happening in 2008. And so as opposed to a reaction on behalf of Putin for Ukraine turning to the West, could this be part of a greater strategy? And if so, how should the neighboring countries prepare and respond?
Yeah, I think if you talk to high-ranking diplomats in the West today, this is their main worry, that Crimea is gone, but what next? And there are many parallels with 1930s, of course. And of course, Putin's not Hitler, and there are many differences. But one thing which you need to know is in 1930s, people also didn't think that things will develop in this way. And every year, people thought, we are an educated and cultured nation. These horrible things cannot happen. And every year, they would lose more and more freedoms and so on and so forth. And if you go back, say, 7 years or 10 years and ask Russians or ask foreigners, could something like 2014 actually happen? Nobody would ever believe it. So these things are changing and people get adapted to it. And now we can accept the reality where Russian troops are in a neighboring country, which is, by the way, a criminal offense in Russia. So what actually is happening is punishable by prison term, by Russian law. in that sense, we don't know what's going to happen. Things are going beyond our previous expectations. But that only reinforces the choice of those countries who joined NATO. These countries said, just in case Russia does things that Soviet Union did, we probably better be in NATO rather than outside of NATO. And Ukraine, which didn't join NATO, apparently is now very sorry. For whatever reason, that didn't happen, but of course, for Putin invading a country which is a NATO member would be a much bigger problem. And in that sense, I think we don't know what's going to happen, but as long as Ukraine is not part of NATO, I think nothing can be removed from this scenario. It's very hard to imagine that Russians and Ukrainians shoot at each other. This is something that is completely against upbringing of all people in Russia and in Ukraine. And I think Ukrainian government's done very well not to fight in the recent weeks. But as I said, nothing can be ruled out now. And I think in the longer run, of course, what matters is if the remaining part of the Ukraine does well economically and socially. And in that sense, this is extremely important for Mr. Putin to say, look, Ukrainians joined, signed the association agreement with the EU, and they're not doing very well. They're a failed state. If Ukrainians, be it Ukraine minus Crimea or Ukraine minus Donetsk, if the rest of Ukraine is prosperous, that is going to be a very strong argument against further aggression. Because part of Mr. Putin's pretext is not only that Russians are being treated badly in Crimea, but also that Ukraine doesn't function. And in that sense, in the longer run, this is my answer. In the short run, I would say, I don't know what can be done. I should say that once we observe what happened in recent weeks, we think that Russian government acts on some kind of different sources of information that we observe. Madam Merkel allegedly told Mr. Obama that Mr. Putin lost touch with reality and lives in a different world. We don't know whether Mr. Putin's rationality is different, or maybe he's just poorly informed. As economists would say, it's observational equivalent. But we think that we should think about outside the box. I hate the idea that there will be shooting in Ukraine. It's just to me, I lived in Ukraine for 10 years. I have a lot of friends in Ukraine. I cannot imagine the Ukrainians and Russians shooting at each other.